We read at the end of last week's reading how the viceroy of Egypt, who happens to be Yosef, the long-lost brother who they had sold into slavery, it's the second year of the famine years, and Yaakov had sent his sons to purchase grain in Egypt. And they immediately come and they accuse him. He accuses them of being spies. And the only way, and he takes one of the brothers captive, and the only way, he says, your brother will be released. And you could come back to purchase more grain if you prove that you have a younger brother, as you claim you do, back in Canaan. And if not, don't come back. They present this problem to their father. Yaakov himself is upset. Why do they have to divulge to this man that they have a younger brother? They said, we have no choice. He knew everything. Through his divination, even knew our names, that each of us of another mother. We're not from the same mother, although we share a common father, and so on and so forth. So to prove our innocence, we have to bring Binyamin. Yaakov says, but Binyamin, Benjamin, being the only surviving child of Rachel, says if anything should happen to him, it's like I've lost Rachel and Yosef all at one time, because he's my only consolation. He's the only remnant of that family. And Rachel being the main matriarch of the Jewish people, and this is her child, this is my only consolation. If anything should happen to him, I go into the grave with tremendous level of suffering. Yehuda takes responsibility. He guarantees his return. How does he guarantee his return? He says to his father, if I don't bring Binyamin back alive, I'm willing to forfeit my share in the world to come. When Yaakov heard that level of commitment, and he knew that Yehuda had the ability, it was within his capacity to succeed in bringing him back, he agreed, due to the circumstances, to release Binyamin into under the auspices of Yehuda, that Yehuda is fully responsible. And as the scene unfolds, this viceroy concocts a situation where he frames Benjamin, by putting his goblet in his saddlebag. And now he's accused of being a thief. The viceroy says, all of you go back. I will retain Benjamin, as my slave. Yehuda will not tolerate this under any circumstance. Will not tolerate this. And he goes and he delineates and replays the scenario from the day they arrived. And he shows clearly how this was a frame-up, where this viceroy has framed the family, they're totally innocent, and as a result of that, he's not backing down. This is the gist of what's going on. And Yosef is adamant, but as much as adamant as Yosef may be, the viceroy, which is not aware he's Yosef, Yehuda is not letting down. And he says to Yosef, and this is the Midrash, that even if I have to destroy all Egypt, I will destroy Egypt. And Yosef knew that Yehuda had the ability, together with his brothers, to destroy Egypt. And it's very interesting. Yosef finally goes and he reveals that he's Yosef. Why? So the Midrash says, because Yosef himself said to himself, if they should destroy Egypt, they will destroy the world. Because Egypt being the height of civilization and the height of power, if Egypt perishes, there's no hope for the world ever to recover. That's why Yosef revealed himself to his brothers Ani Yosef Oro Vichoy. I am Yosef. Is my father still alive? Those were the opening words when he revealed himself. We find that when Yaakov finally went to Egypt to meet his son Yosef, he understood that it's going to be a long haul in Egypt. It's the beginning of the bondage. The Jews are going to be there for 210 years. When the Jews started to proliferate and the numbers became staggering, that each birth was six children in each litter, Egypt instituted the bondage. And this was encouraged by Bilam, the prophet of nations of the world. And the stargazers in Egypt had seen that the Redeemer of Israel is being born. And ultimately, his demise will come about through water. Through water. That he chose, issued a decree that every male child born to a Jewish family should be thrown in the Nile. So the Midrash asks, why did they choose water? Why did they kill the children differently? They could have killed the children by the sword, by fire. Why by water? So the Midrash says, and Rashi cites the Midrash, that because the God of the Jews, when he punishes whoever goes against his people, it's always measure for measure. So if we kill the Jews by the sword, we will be killed by the sword. If we kill the children by fire, their God will kill us by fire. But if we drown them, we've tied God's hands. Why? Because God made a covenant with existence that he will never bring a flood upon the world again to destroy the world. So as a result of this, a question whether this text is correct. Why? Because Egypt's not the whole world. Egypt is only one civilization. There are other civilizations. There are the nations of Canaan. There are nations in Africa besides Egypt. So therefore they say not that the world will be destroyed, rather they would destroy us and will impact on the world in a very serious way if we would be destroyed. So therefore we choose by water, because God made a covenant with the world. He will not bring a flood upon the world. But you see from this Midrash that Yosef revealed who he was, because if they would destroy Egypt, they will destroy the world. Because ultimately, the world cannot continue without Egypt. Even though it's their civilization, but every other civilization was totally dependent on Egypt. And if Egypt's not there, it's just a question of time before they will perish. Therefore, Yosef himself had no choice but to reveal to his brothers, I am Yosef, is my father still alive? This is what we see from the Midrash.
Maisha, did you call Geico?
So now, we find something very interesting. Yosef had two sons. One son he named, the eldest son he named Menashe. The second son he named Ephraim. They were born to him before the famine years began. Now, why did he name his son Menashe? What is the basis for Menashe? The verse says, because God caused me to forget of all the strife and all the suffering of my father's household. Totally, it's as if he had amnesia. All that took place in his father's household was totally erased from his memory and from his emotion. That's why he named Menashe Menashe. Ki nashane Elokim as base aviv es kol hamoli. I forgot about my father's household. I forgot about all the angst and all the suffering and all the contentiousness there. It was wiped off the slate. So I asked the question: what kind of basis is this to name a child? The name Ephraim, I thrived in a land that was not mine. He became the viceroy of Egypt. The day he was released from the dungeon, he rose to be the most powerful person in the world. That's Ephraim. God made me to thrive at a level which is unheard of. But that he was, all his experience of his father's household, it was eradicated and erased as if he had amnesia. Is that a basis to name his eldest child, his most special child? Now, we find that Yosef was the favorite son of Yaakov. Of all the sons, he was the most favored. Why was he favored? So the Torah tells us, Ki ben zukunim lo. So the three interpretations of ben zukunim. Either he was born to him in his old age, he was the 11th son, or Ki ben zukunim lo means that he was the wisest of his sons, and he had certain leadership qualities, which none of the other sons had. So he was the future leader. Or the third reason is because his facial features were identical to his father. He looked exactly like his father, which to Yaakov was an indication that he himself has all the potential of his father. As we find, when Yosef was born, Yaakov says to his father-in-law, after 14 years, I'm ready to leave. But he has to contend with Esav. Esav vowed to kill him. So the Midrash cites a verse from Avadia that Beis Yaakov Eish, Beis Yosef Lahova. The house of Yaakov is fire, the house of Yosef is a flame, and the house of Esav is kash, is straw. If you have a fire which is dormant, and you have straw, how do you attach the fire to the straw? But if you have a flame which reaches out, the flame which reaches out could consume the straw. That was Yosef. So Yosef had the ability to be able to contend with Esav. But it's even more than that. We mentioned that of the three patriarchs, who was the patriarch of exile? The patriarch of exile was Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu, he was in exile more than the other patriarchs. After he was 63 years old, he fled. And then one issue after another, and his last days, he lived the last 17 years of his life, he lived in Egypt, and he passed away in Egypt. He is the patriarch of exile. And that's what we explained. Why did he enact Arvis, the nighttime tefillah? Because what is night? Night is exile. That's Golus, nighttime. That's Yaakov Avinu. Yosef had the characteristics of his father. As Yaakov is able to contend with all the issues of exile, Yosef had that ability to contend with it. He's referred to as Ben Zukunim, the son that was born to him in his old age. But the word Zukunim, if you look at its spelling, the Vav is deleted, and rather than the Vav being there, that it should be pronounced Zukunim, there's what we call a shuruk. There's 3 dots on a diagonal. But without the vowels, it's read Zakanim, Ki Ben Zakanim. So the Balaturim writes over there in his commentary, Ben Zakanim, that all the Torah that he had studied in Shem and Aver, he spent 14 years in Shem and Aver. That was the Shiva of Noach's children and grandson. All that Torah he studied there, he had transmitted only to Yosef, not to his other sons. In this week's Parsha Vayigash, when Yehuda presented Binyamin, that he said, Ki ben zukunim lo, he says, and he was truly born to him at his oldest age, he was the 12th son, Binyamin, the word zukunim is also spelled with the vav deleted. Yaakov also taught all the Torah he had studied in Shem Ve'aver by the Zakain, by the elders. He only taught to Binyamin. Binyamin and Yosef had the ability to contend with exile, not the other brothers. Yosef was in exile for 22 years, all by himself, and he survived it. How did he survive? With all the influences, which literally should have destroyed him, Yosef was Yosef HaTzadik. Because Yosef is the son of Rachel, and Yosef, as we'll explain, has the ability to dominate physicality. He towers over the material. He dictates the material. As a result of that, he was unaffected. He was unscathed. Binyamin had those same characteristics because he's also the son of Rachel. Being the son of Rachel, he has the ability to counter all those influences. But that's only if you have the Torah that Yaakov studied in Shem and Aver. Because that Torah, Shem and Aver, witnessed the great flood. He understood how to contend, to deal with all those issues of why the world was destroyed. All those approaches and those protocols were transmitted by Shem and Aver to Yaakov. Those same protocols were transmitted to Yosef, Zekanim, and the same protocols were transmitted to Binyamin, because they were both the sons, the children of Rachel. Now, let's talk about Rachel. Who was Rachel, the matriarch? When Yaakov saw Rachel, he knew immediately she is the primary matriarch. Of course, he had a sense of her neshama, her soul, that her soul would be compatible with his, that she's the matriarch. But the Torah goes to describe her beauty. She was a beautiful woman. She was one of the most beautiful women who ever lived. Why is the Torah sharing that with us? The Gemara tells us, the Talmud tells us, Ein zaro shel Esav nofel el b'yad zaro shel Rachel. The progeny of Esav can only fall in the hands of the progeny of Rachel. That means any battle we ever had with Amalek, with Edom, which is, Amalek is Edom and the Edomites, you had to have, within that battle, you had to have the progeny of Rachel. They had to be part of that battle. For instance, the first encounter with Amalek, who did Moshe send to lead the Jews into battle? Yeshua ben Nun. Yeshua ben Nun, Joshua, was from the tribe of Ephraim, which is what? That's Yosef. The next encounter with Amalek was Purim. Who was Purim? Mordechai and Esther. Mordechai and Esther are from the tribe of Benjamin. Again, children of Rachel. Shaul, King Saul, who was sent to destroy Amalek by Shmuel HaNavi, by Samuel the prophet, he failed. And because he failed, he was dethroned. And he wasn't qualified to be the king any longer. That's when David was coronated and anointed to be the king forever. That's the Davidic line. But Shaul initially was meant to be the king. He failed. Shaul was who? Shaul also. King Saul was from the tribe of Binyamin. This is the progeny of Rachel. Why only from the progeny of Rachel? Why the progeny of Rachel? Why are they Aish? Why are they Lahava? They have the flame. They have the ability to consume Edom, to consume Amalek. Why? So we explained, what does Edom represent? Edom personifies and epitomizes physicality on the most exaggerated level, the physical. When Yaakov had sent a valuable gift to Esav to somehow to diminish and diffuse his anger, sent a very valuable gift, herds and flocks, and even diamonds with various groups of people. So he said to Yaakov, what is this all about? He says, to find favor in the eyes of my master. So Esav says, but I have so much. I have so much. Yaakov says, you may have so much, I have it all. Meaning, Esav says, I'm nearly there, I'm not there yet. Meaning, Esav, as much as he had, until he had it all, he didn't have it. Yaakov, the material, its value is only to facilitate the spiritual. It's as much as God gives him, he doesn't need more than that. So Esav epitomizes and personifies the material. What does Rachel represent? Rachel represents beauty on the most magnified level. most exaggerated level. But who's Rachel Imenu? Rachel, the matriarch, dedicated that beauty, all her physicality, only to serve God. That means she took the physicality, which normally would naturally you'd be inclined to go elsewhere with it, and she went and she dominated it. She dominated the ultimate level of beauty, of physical. So because that was Rachel Imenu's ability, her children, Yosef, was the most beautiful man who ever lived. There was no more beautiful person ever than Yosef who ever walked the face of the earth. Who is Yosef? Yosef was Yosef HaTzadik, because he was the son of Rachel. Binyamin also, he was the son of Rachel. Therefore, just as Rachel dominated her beauty, her physicality, her children have the ability to dominate whatever represents the physical. Edom represents the physical. Therefore, only the progeny of Edom fall into the hands of the children of Rachel, because they have that ability to dominate the physical. They transcend the physical, and they utilize it. But where do we find it? Now, Yosef is sold into slavery. He's sold to one of the ministers of Egypt, Potiphar. Okay? He's not there long. And whatever he's involved in, tremendous success, to the point where his master recognizes his ability and he transfers over all his affairs to Yosef. And all his holdings were overseen only by Yosef. The minister himself had nothing to do with his material affairs any longer. And we're talking about a person that came in as a lowly slave. And within a short period of time, he rises to power within the household of his master. And we're talking, he's a minister, he's probably a very wealthy person. But he oversaw all his affairs, material affairs. Then he's accused by his master's wife that he tried to rape her. He's thrown into a dungeon. Okay? He's there for a short period of time. What happens? You know what happens to Yosef? He becomes the unofficial warden of the prison. The warden, the same words that we use for Potiphar, that he had no interest because he gave over the running of his affairs to Yosef. The warden no longer had any involvement in running the prison. Who ran the prison? Yosef ran the prison. It's unheard of. You come in as the prisoner, and the warden appreciates your ability, he gives you over the whole prison to run the prison. Now he's in the prison for 12 years. He's finally released. How long does it take him to soar to be the most powerful person in the world? The day that he was released from prison and he interpreted the dreams of Paro, who's the monarch of the leading civilization, Paro says, after he hears the interpretation of Yosef, have you ever seen a person who has the spirit of God within him? This is the man, he will be my viceroy. And he removes his ring, which indicates the transfer of power. And he's the only thing I have above you is I am the king. Outside of that, every decision that's made on a global level is your decision. So again, what are we speaking about here? This is the ultimate level of dominating material. He's dominating the world. Yosef is in a position that nobody is able to receive food. Any movement, freedom of movement in Egypt is only if you're authorized by Yosef. Otherwise, you have no freedom of movement. You cannot carry a weapon in Egypt unless you're authorized by Yosef. You're not permitted to ride a horse, which is an indication of status, unless you're authorized by Yosef. There was nothing Yosef didn't control. Why? Yosef being the son of Rachel, Rachel dominates material, transcends material. Yosef transcends material. Therefore, he dominates material. That's Yosef and that's Binyamin. Now, when Yosef came to Egypt, when he was released from prison, minimally, the Talmud tells us that the night before he was released, Gabriel the archangel was sent him by Hashem to teach him 70 languages. When Yosef left the dungeon the next day, Yosef was fluent in 71 languages, Hebrew being his natural language, and all the other 70 languages. So he's fully fluent, well-versed in 71 languages. Paro was only well-versed in 70 languages, not 71. When Paro became aware that Yosef knew 71 languages and he knew 70, he adjured him with an oath that he swore to him that he will never divulge that to anybody, that he knows 71 languages, which is one language more than Paro. Paro is 70. Why was it so important? Nobody should know. Because it was known that if it would be known he knows 71 and Paro knows 70, Paro would be dethroned. He would remove from power. Now the question is why? What's the difference between 70 and 71? And it would become public knowledge, and it's not kept between the two of them, Paro would be removed from office. What's the understanding? It once mentioned the name of Rabbi Bachya that the monarch of Egypt was called Paro, the Pharaoh. Meaning they were called Pharaoh, but factually each king had his own personal name. What does Pharaoh represent? What does Paro represent? So Rabbi Bachya explains that if you look at the Hebrew spelling of Paro, the letters Ayin Pei Reish, Ofer, are contained within that title. Meaning the Egyptian civilization and all their idolatry, their beliefs, was based upon everything in existence is earthy. Even angels, they exist. There's no such thing as God, an infinite being. Everything is finite and it's limited to earth. And therefore, Paro, Ayin Pei Reish, spells Ofer, earth. Everything is earthiness. Now, what is earthiness? How do we connote earthiness number-wise? So the famous word from the Maral, the Rabbi Bachya, creation was the 7-day process. 7 connotes nature. The natural order is 70, is 7. 70 is also the natural order. 10 times 7 is 70. 71 is the equivalent of 8. 8 is supernatural. There's something which transcends the 7. Paro knew 70 languages. You could only have 70 contained within one person. The moment we have 71, what is 71? And as much as the Midrash tells us, Paro tried to study Hebrew, he couldn't retain the language. He maxed out at 70 because 70 is natural. Yosef had 71. So Yosef being one person having capacity that he could transcend the 70. What does that say about Yosef? He's a spiritual person. He dominates the physical. The moment we know there's something which is beyond the physical, it's a refutation on the whole basis for the Egyptian civilization. So the reason why Paro would be dethroned, if it's known that anybody knows 71, not only he will be dethroned, because it reveals that the whole foundation of the Egyptian civilization is false. There's something beyond the physical. And they've been living this fiction lie all these years. Therefore, Paro made him take an oath. He was sworn never to divulge that he knows 71 languages for that reason. But who's the one who knows that? Who's the one who dominates? Who transcends the 7 or the 70 to control all existence, even to dictate to Paro? That's Yosef. Yosef who Mashbir. Yosef accumulated all the wealth of the world to be in Egypt. Now, why did Yaakov teach all that Torah that he had studied Shed V'Ever to Yosef? Because he knew ultimately the Jews would have to experience an exile. We're going to Egypt. Because that was the covenant between the parts. God said to Avram, your children will be strangers in a land which is not theirs. They'll be enslaved. They will be oppressed, but ultimately they will go out with great wealth after 400 years. So if you calculate the time from the birth of Yitzhak till the Jews left Egypt, it was 400 years. Yaakov knew this. Yosef was the natural successor of his father. Even more so, He will contend with all the issues of Egypt. He will prepare Egypt for the Jewish exile, that the Jews should be able to survive that exile. Without Yosef preparing the land, the country for the Jewish influx, the Jews couldn't survive. We've mentioned Ahmed Arizal that when Yosef sold the food to the Egyptians, what happened? Yosef says, before you're eligible to purchase food, you must circumcise yourself. If you don't circumcise yourself, you're not qualified to buy food, to purchase food. So they went to complain to Paro. They said, you put a madman in this position here. He's doing something to us which is unheard of. He wants all the Egyptians to circumcise themselves. So Paro says, you people are at fault. You knew that a famine was coming. You should have stored away all the grain during the years of plenty. Why didn't you? So they said, we did. But Yosef decreed that it should rot. So Paro says to his subjects, as he decreed it, the grain should rot. What would be if he decrees that we should all die? You better listen to what he says. If he wants you to circumcise yourselves, you better circumcise yourselves. So all the Egyptians were circumcised. And only then were they eligible to purchase grain. But the question is, what does circumcision have to do with the Egyptians? So he cites the Arizal, that the Arizal writes that the Rambam in Mor Nevuchim, in Guide for the Perplexed, writes that a male who's circumcised, his sexual drive is curbed and has limitation. With the foreskin, it's out of control. Being circumcised, it tempers it. Since Yosef understood his family's coming, he wants to elevate the quality of the people, the civilization, that they shouldn't be fully indulgent in this promiscuous type of lifestyle. So he's elevating them to prepare for the exile. That's what he's doing, Yosef. That's why that was a prerequisite to be eligible to purchase grain. Now, what Yosef suffered under the hands of his brothers, all the contentiousness, and then they threw him into the pit, and they stripped off the garment that his father gave him. And before he was sold, he begged for his life. He begged them. The level of trauma they put him through is not to be believed. After suffering under their hands, could you dedicate your life to maintain the guarantee of their existence? It's something which is impossible. Humanly, it's impossible. You're so emotionally, mentally scarred because of that experience, it's impossible. So how could Yosef be the provider in Egypt after what he was through to provide for his brothers? As I said, there was no love lost between them. And as much as he would want to love his brothers, understanding the importance, he can't. How can he? You know what happened? Something miraculous happened. All of a sudden, he gets married. And all of a sudden, emotionally, mentally, the past has been totally erased from his memory. All the trauma, all the suffering, it's as if he never experienced it. What does that say? It was a miracle. That was a confirmation that he's meant to be the provider for the Jewish people. Therefore, his firstborn, who's the most special, what does he name him? He names him Menashe. God has erased and caused me to forget my father's household and all the angst, all the trauma that I suffered there. It was a miracle. It was impossible otherwise. That was a confirmation that from now going forward, when he was married, he has to start providing for the upcoming exile of the Jewish people. When they come, he doesn't know. But whenever they come, everything has to be in place. Therefore, he started the circumcision. He started to store the grain, having in mind his family. He will be their provider. There's a midrash that tells us how many years did Yaakov provide for Yosef? Yosef was sold into slavery at the age of 17. The last 17 years of Yaakov's life, he lived in Egypt. Who was the sole provider for Yaakov in Egypt, materially speaking? So it says, just as Yaakov was the sole provider for Yosef, the first 17 years of his life, the last 17 years of Yaakov's life, who was the sole provider? The sole provider was Yosef. Whatever amenity Yaakov needed to maintain himself, Yosef fully provided for his father. It's as if Yosef was the father of the Jewish people. Not only for his brothers, even for his father, he provided. So therefore, Yosef being put as the first rising to viceroy, what does that mean? It's unheard of. You say it happens in the household of his master, Potiphar. It happens in the prison. He becomes the unofficial warden. But now, a moment ago, he's in the dungeon, rotting in the dungeon forever. And within moments, he rises to be literally, globally in control of the world. The viceroy of Egypt. It's clear something's happening. So he's actually experiencing what? Who he's supposed to be. He dominates the material. But why? For what sake? For what purpose? Only to facilitate the spirituality, to guarantee the eternal survival of the Jewish people. Because the prerequisite to Sinai, we had to spend that time in Egypt. It was me'abdus l'cherus. We went from bondage to freedom. But what was the purpose of that freedom? Only that 50 days later, we should be standing at the foot of Sinai. When the Torah is offered to us, we say Nasv Nishma. That was the value of all this. Now, I mentioned, it seems from the Gemara, from the Talmud, that Gabriel, the archangel, taught him the 71 languages the night before he left. He was released from prison. And Paro immediately saw it. There's a Balaturim who writes, when he was a slave in the household of Potiphar, and it says, and all that belonged to his master, he oversaw. It's alluded over there that Gabriel already taught him the 71 languages when he was in the household of Potiphar. What was the value? When did Yosef start showing this ability of dominating material? It says before he was sold to slave by his brothers, he was the lead shepherd. It doesn't show from there he dominates material. He's more qualified. So he was the lead shepherd. But when he was the slave and he rises to such power that he dominates all the material of his master, that's the first time he's demonstrating the characteristic of being the son of Rachel. He dominates material. We're not talking an ordinary wealthy man. He's a minister in the court of Paro. So because he's assuming that role of dominating physical at night, in that context, God sends Gabriel the archangel, teach him 71 languages. Because the ability to speak 71 languages means you're an embodiment of something which transcends material. 71. 70 is the natural order. 71 means you transcend that natural order. So that already began in the household of Potiphar. When he went to prison, he already spoke the 71 languages. As an innocent person being accused of something terrible. Within moments, he's the unofficial warden. He leaves the prison. Within moments, he's the viceroy of Egypt, the most advanced civilization controlling the world. It's very interesting. We find, could you imagine, all the wealth of Egypt, of the world, was contained within Egypt, because the world, not only was Egypt experienced the famine, all Canaan experienced the famine. So all the people of all the surrounding lands came to purchase grain, and they exhausted all the wealth of the world, and it was all stored away by Yosef. Now, when the Jews left Egypt, so what did the Egyptians believe? Now you got Fort Knox. You go there, you have gold bars stored away in the vaults. If you start counting today and live till 70 years, you wouldn't finish counting those bars of gold. That's how much gold is there. The amount of gold was something. What did the Egyptians believe? This is our financial backbone. We have all the wealth of the world. little did they understand, they are only the bankers for the Jewish people to hold it. When the Jews are ready to go, they're taken with them. So all the wealth came to Egypt only so the Jews, when they leave Egypt, to fulfill the prophecy that after the years of bondage and oppression, they're going out with great wealth. So again, Yosef was crucial, and Yosef knew this, that ultimately on the way out, they're taking it with him. So Yosef gathering the wealth, not only did he prepare for the famine by providing the food for them when they were in Egypt and the location where they settled in Goshen, but even for the redemption, when they left, even the gold that was stored in a safe location, so when they leave, they should have the gold to take with them. The fulfillment of the prophecy. So Yosef was a key person in every aspect of the bondage. They should survive the bondage and the exodus, that you should go to become the Am Hashem at Sinai. But if Yosef would have still experienced and had memories of that trauma and that abuse and the cruelty of his brothers, humanly would have been impossible to do. As a result of that, when God caused him to forget all that as if it never happened and to declare that as miracle, his first son, Menashe, was named to allude to the fact of that miracle, that he should be able to be the proper provider, so the Jews should be able to survive the exile and ultimately be qualified to go to Sinai to receive the Torah.